October Girls presents an original series, House of Spiders, Part 1, A Dangerous Game, where a young woman's night gets a bit more exciting than she had anticipated. She sat at the edge of the bed, lifting her glimmering curtain of blonde hair from her neck. Her skin glistened with a light sweat. Lifting her arms above her head, she stretched her tired muscles, arching her back as she did so. The lights in the cheapest room of Motel Amour were off, the moon casting long shadows through the window. The man in the bed next to her lay face down, his arms spread wide, the moonlight casting its glow over his well-muscled back. She took time to appreciate his masculine beauty and inhaled deeply. The room smelled of lavender, her scent of choice, and clean fabric roughly thrown to the floor. She canted her head to the side as she gazed at the man and smiled. He didn't stir as she lightly ran her fingertips along his well-muscled back, all the way down his spine. He was handsome, with black tousled hair, bright blue eyes that had a way of drawing a woman in. She pressed a kiss to his temple. "This was fun. Sleep well," she said, chuckling softly. She cast her gaze around the room and finished dressing, the tight black dress reaching to her mid-thighs. She saw the man's wallet on the bedside table and relieved it of its cash, tucking it into her own wallet. She slipped it into her small handbag and checked her reflection. Her makeup had held up well, and her hair actually looked better than before. Satisfied, she finished packing her things into her bag in precise, practiced motions and opened the door to leave. She pulled a silver lighter from her bag, followed by a short blunt, lighting the end. Flicking the embers on the floor, she pulled the door shut behind her. The evening air was slightly cool on her skin as she walked toward the main town strip. It had been a good night so far, especially considering how empty she had felt yesterday. She had needed this. An evening out where she was her own agent, her own person, where she could do anything with anybody. No rules to limit her, and she didn't want it to end. She checked her watch and saw that it was only midnight. The evening was still young. She looked up at her favorite bar, the Tipsy Cat, and felt a grin pull at her lips again. There was still plenty of time for another drink. After all, this was her night of freedom. What could happen? She brushed some hair from her eyes and took another deep breath as she pulled the door open. Lucian took another sip of his wine, the sweet flavor of Moscato going down easily. His previous girl had liked Moscato too. Thinking of her made him lift his glass in a small salute to her memory. "Adieu, my beauty," he thought as he drank deeply. He closed his eyes, remembering her screams, her pleas for help, for mercy that never came. "Another round, sir?" asked the bartender, a pretty brunette with a low-cut top. He appraised her in leisurely frankness, making her smile at him. Somebody likes attention, he thought, as he considered the question. It was close to 1 a.m, and he had been hunting all night with nobody interesting presenting themselves. The bartender was by far the most interesting woman in the Tipsy Cat, charming tips out of every single patron. He appreciated the simple use of psychology she employed with every customer, somehow knowing who wanted a conversation and who wanted to be left alone, who wanted to be flirted with, and who wanted swift, inefficient service. She was smart and attractive enough. He smiled politely, pulled out a bill from his wallet and handed it to her. "Yes, please. And treat yourself to one as well after the bar closes," he said as the bartender sent him a polite smile. "Perhaps I'll see you." He was cut off by loud, inebriated laughter from the opposite end of the bar. It was an attractive, husky sound. He looked up and saw a beautiful blonde in a tight black dress sitting with some other men around her. Her cheeks were red, and she wore a large grin as she lifted a shot glass, tossing back the liquor with ease. How had he not seen her before? "Well, hello, my beauty," he thought to himself, until he realized he had paused and was still holding the other end of the money. The bartender lifted a brow at him. "On second thought, use the rest of this to buy a drink for the blonde at the bar," he said lightly. The bartender's smile faltered, clearly insulted. With a small nod, she turned and prepared his order. He watched the blonde as the bartender delivered the drink. She laughed drunkenly and sent Lucian a hazy look as the bartender gestured at him. She was even more beautiful when she looked directly at him. Her glassy green eyes glinted with the light. She winked at him and waved him over confidently. The men near her narrowed their eyes at Lucian. He ignored them. He rose and walked toward the blonde, and she went to stand as he approached, but instead tottered on her feet and sat right back down. He grinned again as she extended her hand toward him. Instead of shaking it, he bowed toward her like an English nobleman, and she laughed at him like it was a joke. One of the men near her tried to gain her attention again. "Alara, do you want to dance with us?" he asked, and his friends grunted in agreement, still sending territorial looks at Lucian, who continued to look at her calmly. She laughed again, not looking at the other men. "No, I think I'll stay here," she said as she met Lucian's eyes. The men shrugged at one another and shuffled onto the dance floor. Lucian sat next to her and assessed how far along she was. Her eyes were glassy, and she moved as if her joints were made of water, the expressions too exaggerated, her smile a bit too slobby. "What's your name, babe?" she slurred, tossing her hair over her shoulder. He felt a prickle of annoyance. He hated women like this. Pretty girls who thought they could do whatever they wanted because they were attractive. They lorded their beauty over men, causing so much chaos in the world, just like his ex-wife. This woman was a perfect example why he loved his little hobby. He sent a practiced smile toward his next prey, leaning on one elbow. "My name is Lucian. Are you looking for some trouble tonight?" he asked as he had done with all of the other girls. She laughed again, leaning back casually. "Always." A few hours later, Lucian pulled into his driveway, the blonde Alara in his passenger seat. She leaned forward, looking at his house. "I've never seen a mansion before," she said excitedly. She was focused on applying some lipstick and rummaging in her bag. Lucian used this moment to pull a small rag from his pocket. "A high-class girl like you? I don't believe it," Lucian said. He took out a small bottle from under his seat and poured some liquid onto the rag. Her arms crept over his shoulders and soft lips brushed against his neck. He turned and met her lips with his, covertly spreading the rag in his hand. He deepened the kiss as she let out a throaty chuckle. Her hands brushed against his jaw and throat as he pulled away. She still had that hazy look in her eye and was still speaking far too loud, her voice starting to go hoarse. "Aren't you going to invite me inside?" she asked, looking at him through her lashes, glancing at his estate. It sat nestled in the hills of Washington, looking out on the city below. He owned well over 50 acres of land, his own private kingdom. He smiled at her in anticipation. He was surprised she didn't smell the chloroform, strong in the confined space of the car. She must have been more drunk than he thought. "Perfect." "Of course. "That's why we're here," he replied. Then, in a rush, he brought the rag of chloroform to her face. Her eyes widened in surprise as he forced her head against the window. She tried to fight him, but the smell was intoxicating and she soon went still. He leaned closer to her unconscious form, noting how her eyebrows had pulled together and how her lips were still in a grimace. "You were looking for trouble tonight. Guess what?" he whispered into her ear. "You found it." Her head hurt like someone had hit her with a baseball bat. She came awake in painful degrees, first registering the throbbing in her skull, then the hard floor beneath her. She smelled it then. Her eyes opened to see a partially decaying body. It had long, dirty hair. She couldn't really tell what color it had been. It was naked, and the limbs were broken in several places. "Good morning," came the man's voice. What was his name? Right, Lucien. Alara rolled away from the body, her heart beating out of her chest. She took in her surroundings, seeing she was in a small concrete room with a single door at the other end. It was illuminated by a bare light bulb in the center of the room. There were 3 other bodies with her, all feminine and all missing their clothes. She felt her breath catch at the sight of it. Her stomach rebelled as she stood. She saw a small camera in the corner of the room then. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking despite herself. "I think you know," Lucien's voice came again from a small speaker in the ceiling. "Why?" she began, but Lucien cut her off. "Why? Because women like you deserve punishment, and I'm here to deliver it," he said, chuckling. It sounded a bit crazy. "Women like you think you can go around the world using your beauty to control those who've earned power and respect. You're wrong. You're only breathing right now because I haven't decided to kill you yet." Alara straightened her spine. She frowned at the camera as he said his monologue, but gave him no reply. A moment passed before he spoke again. "What? No begging? No bartering?" he asked, but she continued to stay silent, looking at the camera. Another moment passed. "Well, I must say, I'm happy you're going to make this fun for me. I haven't had a fighter yet. Let me explain how this is going to work. You have 3 minutes to find your way out of that room. The vents are filling with acidic gas that will corrode your skin." He broke off as she started to move. She ignored him as she went to the door and tried the lock. She checked her watch, noting the time. She pulled in a deep breath, and her heart lessened its pace slightly. She closed her eyes and allowed herself 1 moment. She felt the anxiety, the fear rush away. She had taken several classes on meditation and mastered her emotions. As she breathed, she felt her mind calm down. She opened her eyes and checked her watch again. Just under 30 seconds had passed. "Tick-tock, tick-tock, a bit over 2 minutes until you're he began, but she continued to ignore him. She had blocked the voice out and looked at the door. She looked at the handle and saw it was a simple lock. She had no pins to pick it with, though. She gritted her teeth and looked at the rest of the room. Beside the bodies, it was unremarkable. She stood back from the door and looked at it as a whole then. She noticed something. The door was ornate, with wood inlay and a steel patterning, like a maze, and a small slot near the bottom. Despite everything, despite the danger and death by corrosive gas, she lifted her eyes to the camera and felt herself smile. She loved puzzles. "Think you have an idea?" he chirped. She shrugged her shoulders. She looked around the room and went to the only other objects, the bodies. Bracing herself, she rolled one over and looked at it. Nothing. She went to the other one that had been next to her with the broken limbs and started to examine it. It was disgusting. But she clenched her jaw and continued until she felt something small and metallic forced into one of the broken bones in the arm. A magnet. She went to the door and placed the magnet against the wood. She traced it along the pattern, directing it downward toward the slot at the bottom. 20 seconds, Lucien said, but she remained focused. 13 seconds. She refused to look at the camera. She refused to gaze at the vents. It would do no good. Her emotions shut down. She embraced that emptiness inside her. There was only survival that mattered. She refused to die to this bastard. She reached the end of the pattern and lifted the magnet. The key dropped into the slot. 5, 4, 3. She thrust the key into the lock, turned it, and wrenched the door open. She slammed it shut behind her as she heard a metal plate sliding behind it and a small hissing coming from the room. She took another breath. She stood tall again and checked her watch, then glanced upward. Cameras were in each corner of the room that she now stood in. She saw that there were several tall walls placed in the room. They came up to within a foot from the ceiling. It took her a moment to realize what this room was. Another maze? Seriously? She said out loud. Very good. Some of your kind do have intelligence, Lucien said over another speaker. And congratulations. You're the only one who has gotten this far. I'm excited to see— How much time do I have left? Alara asked, cutting him off. Do not interrupt me, Lucien said, his voice a growl. Alara went silent, looking at one of the cameras. Several tense moments passed, but she kept her spine straight, her eyes unblinking. Finally, Lucien spoke again. That's better. Don't let that happen again. No time limit for this room. Your objective is simply to get to the other side. Alara thought for a moment. What happens when I get there? She asked. A deep laugh was her only answer. Steeling herself, she took a step forward until she approached the first intersection. These walls were a rough steel coming from the floor to several feet above her head. When she reached the end of the first turn, she saw that she could go right or left. She tried to see to the other side of the room, but the walls were too tall and were placed close together. She estimated that they were a claustrophobic 3 feet apart. Each wall was the same. She realized that she was going to get lost. She thought for a moment, trying to find a way to keep track of where she was. She looked for a way to mark the wall, but there was nothing. Gross. She thought for a moment before she realized that she didn't have another option. She lifted a finger to her mouth. Before she could hesitate, she bit down hard on her pointer finger and blood welled up. She reached out to the wall and drew an arrow to the left. She went around the corner but only had time to hear another laugh from the speaker before a section of the floor gave out from beneath her. She saw a trapdoor with electric wire at the bottom of a pit. She stepped back quickly, but only had time to register the first trapdoor before another appeared beneath her feet. She stepped backward again and jumped. She wedged her body between the tight walls, elevating herself off the floor. More laughter came over the speaker as her dress rode up higher on her thighs. You bastard, she thought angrily at the camera as her legs started to burn. She looked at the floor. Well, it looks like that wasn't an option. She looked up at the space above the walls and felt her lips quirk. She braced against the wall again to shift her position so all 4 of her limbs could press upward. At first, she dropped several inches before she was able to regain traction. Then she climbed until she was able to lever herself into the small space between the top of the walls and the ceiling. Alara angled herself so she was on her back. It was surprisingly comfortable, and she was able to let herself relax just for a moment. I knew you would make this fun for me. It would seem I have to make a few adjustments, said Lucien. Alara didn't respond, but stared at the ceiling. Lucien continued. The question is, what's your plan now? Nothing, Alara said calmly. I'm staying here. It's the safest spot, Alara replied. She traced a small pattern on the ceiling as she spoke. Nothing. You'll starve to death, or I'll kill you now if you just sit there. Would that be fun for you, though?
I will kill you,
Lucian threatened. Alara let another moment of silence crawl before she answered. You can, but again, that would be a bit boring, wouldn't it?
You have 10 seconds to move, whore, or I will release the acidic gas into this room. Get down!
Alara pivoted her head to look at the closest camera. Do it then. She closed her eyes. After a moment, her stomach clenched as she heard a small grinding noise from the other end of the room. She waited for the gas to hit her and took a moment to silently curse herself for getting into this situation. She was better than this, but now she was going to die in a small room in some serial killer's house. She braced for the pain to begin as she felt the air pressure change. Nothing happened. She opened her eyes and saw an opening at the other end of the room. The space beyond was dark. She checked her watch again, nodded, and crawled toward the opening. Lucian stood against the wall, looking at the room he had never gotten to use before. He had held the rag of chloroform in his hand and waited as he listened to the bitch approaching the door. He felt tired. It had been a long night, and his head was starting to ache. He rubbed his eyes, vision blurring at the edges. He was sure he had had enough energy to finish her off, though. He blinked and rolled the fatigue out of his arms as he continued to wait. Fine, he thought. You want me to kill you myself? Then you're going to regret it. After what seemed like an eternity, he heard her in the doorway and tensed, readying the rag. She took one step forward and he grinned. Knowing he would enjoy her screams the most, he launched himself toward her. She leapt backward and dodged him. He saw her sprint toward the other side of the room and growled as he pressed the button on the wall, the panel sliding seamlessly back into place. Don't bother running, he said, straightening. He looked at her and saw she was calm. No, not calm. She was smiling, her eyes cat-like in the low light. He matched her grin and gestured toward a table at the side of the room. An operating table with a small tray next to it. Several tools spread neatly on it. I'm going to take you apart, he promised, but he let out another growl as she continued to smile at him. What are you smirking at? Trying to be brave? She raised her watch so it was facing him. He saw a timer that was flashing 0. It's been over 4 hours, Alara said. You should be feeling it by now. He furrowed his brow and tried to step toward her. His legs felt like they were made of lead, and Alara seemed to move twice as fast as she calmly stepped toward him, evading his fist easily. He tried to take another step, but his legs gave out. Alara caught him over her shoulder. He tried to fight, but his limbs were no longer obeying him. Alara grunted as she carried him to the operating table and dumped him unceremoniously on its hard surface. Pain rang through his head as he hit the table. He tried to speak, but all he could do was make a weak gurgling sound. You're new at this, aren't you? Alara asked as he heard her playing with the metal instrument. The serial killer business is pretty competitive, you know. There's no room for amateurs, especially sloppy ones like yourself. He tried to speak again, but only could let out another gurgle. I have to thank you, though. I never expected someone to get the better of me like that. You see, monsters like you who drug people to have their way with them really piss me off. I like to give you a taste of your own medicine, she explained, flashing a hook-like device in front of his hazy vision. 2 in 1 night. Lucky me! He got to go to sleep with my personal variant of venom. I was going to do the same for you. The hook caught the light, momentarily blinding him. You've given me such fun toys to play with, baby. It would be a shame to waste them. She made a show of putting on gloves and picked up a drill. Now, where should we start? Agent Aranea was sitting at his desk, late into the night as usual, when his phone rang. Sir, we have another one, said the officer. He passed his hand over his tired face and sipped his coffee. Another body? Another killer. Except it looks like he was tortured. Closing his eyes, Aranea leaned back in his chair. Just like the rest? Just like the rest. Talk screen came back positive for venom-induced paralysis. Venom? Yeah, and a spider had been shoved in his mouth. He tightened his jaw, hesitating before he asked the next question. What type was this one? The officer hesitated before answering. A black widow.